class, I wanted to just touch on some issues on reliability and validity. We talked about that really fast along with everything else during last class, but I wanted to give you a few more examples so that you can really better understand the terms, and I think they might be useful to you in your presentation as you think about limitations, strengths, and weaknesses of the particular studies you've read for your presentation. I know I used the example of the watch that consistently says 6:49. You look at it 2 hours later, it still says 6:49. It's very reliable, not very valid, because validity has to do with, are you measuring what you say you're measuring? The watch is supposed to be telling you about the time. It's actually not. But it is very reliable because the definition of reliability is over repeated attempts will you get the same or similar results. But a watch isn't exactly a sociological study, so I wanted to give you examples that would be more relevant to the studies that you're looking at. And of course, I did allude to when you're looking at your methods section and you want to think about directions for future research or limitations of the study. Remember that example I gave where if you see something about that the sample was in a rural, white, Midwestern area, it's a very homogeneous, limited population, and so if you did that study somewhere else, you might get very different results, which would compromise the reliability of the study, but not necessarily the validity of the study. So you want to be precise in whether you're talking about reliability or validity. Another example I like to use about reliability is, say you were on campus and you needed to do a survey on like a traditional residential campus, right, about people's satisfaction with parking, and if there were things that need to be improved, maybe the university is looking into building another parking lot or something like that. So they do a survey, but say they did a survey in the summer when hardly anybody is on campus. Well, then people might be fairly satisfied with the parking situation, but if you did it on fall opening week, they might have a very different view of parking, and so your reliability, because you do it over multiple attempts at different times, you get very different results, right? Your reliability is going to be compromised in that particular incident. So you want to read about where they did the study, when, and those are clues or where parts you can check to where reliability issues might be at play there. Validity, on the other hand, is, are you measuring what you say you're going to measure? Of course, all good intentions, you try to measure what you say you're going to measure, but at times there might be some issues. For example, there's something on page 91 of your core text called the Hawthorne effect, which actually was discovered in a business type study. If you read about it, they were trying to measure the effect of different lighting on worker productivity. And so they went into a factory and varied up the lighting every so often to see what the productivity level would be. Well, surprisingly, no matter what lighting style they used, the worker productivity was always pretty high. And so what they eventually discovered is that they weren't actually measuring the effect of the lighting as much as the effect of them knowing that they were being watched. So the Hawthorne effect refers to people knowing that they're being watched and then adjusting their behavior accordingly. So that is a weakness of the observation study design, but of course there are always ways to try and minimize or counteract potential issues of your study design. So for example, there was a pretty famous study done a few years ago on racial attitudes and stereotyping among preschoolers. That is, how early do people actually learn race? And the study actually showed, well, earlier than was thought. Before it was thought kind of elementary, maybe age or greater, but they're actually 3 to 5 year olds. This woman did observation study, and in her whole method section she goes to great lengths to talk about how she really took steps to let the kids know that she wasn't a teacher, she wasn't an authority figure. And eventually, after a while, when they did things and she didn't discipline them, or they started to really treat her as a peer, even though she was a lot taller and bigger than them. They got the sense that she was not an authority, and so she felt she kind of got greater access to peer knowledge, right? And that perhaps the Hawthorne effect wasn't so much at play in her particular study. And of course, you can do that with adults as well. Different things you can do, become a part of the group, do participant observation, and other things. guarantee them anonymity, that you won't use their name, they'll change their name, they'll change the place name, and so forth. There are all kinds of ways that you can try to keep that in check, but you do want to acknowledge that you know that that's a potential threat to your validity, and here are the ways that you try to minimize it. One last point on that slide number 11, right under actually reliability and validity, is another term called social desirability. And that's also one you want to be aware of when you're looking at the validity of a study, because there are certain topics, and in any different culture at any point in time it varies, but where people might give you a certain answer because they want to look a certain way to a researcher, or even on an anonymous survey at times. It depends on the topic. Sociologists, social scientists have found over time there are actually certain topics for which your validity will be higher in a face-to-face qualitative interview or observational study, but there are other topics for which actually an anonymous survey might be a little better. For example, questions about illegal behavior and questions about sexual behavior. Studies have shown there's a pattern that's clear that you're better off doing anonymous mailed or internet surveys on those topics. You get closer to validity that way than talking to them face to face. Racial attitudes, on the other hand, my area, tends to be the opposite. There's a social desirability, and this wasn't always the case. Okay, so it's a particular culture, particular place and time. You have to be aware. So, for example, in the 50s and 60s, perfectly acceptable to say you're racially prejudiced. Today, not so much. Well, depending on the setting, but to an anonymous random researcher, the general pattern is that people aren't as willing to open up to them about their racial prejudices than if you were to sit down with them in an open-ended interview. There's actually a very innovative study by Eduardo Benito Silva called "I'm Not a Racist, But," or "Colorblind Racism," or "Racism Without Racist." He's published a lot, so there are many different titles of it, but he got a lot of acclaim for this because he used multiple method, which I told you is very rare anyway. Sociologists tend to use one study design or another just because of the cost and time factors, but he got himself enough funding and support and such where he could actually do a large-scale survey and then compare it with the results of the in-depth observations on racial attitude stuff. And he actually found that in one setting, the survey setting, people are giving the socially desirable responses, but in the in-depth sit-down time, particularly with the same race interviewer, they're modifying and qualifying their responses a little bit. What does that mean? Does that mean, oh, we caught them in a lie? No, that's not how sociologists look at it, because remember, we're cultural relativists. So we're very interested in what is it about the culture, right, at this point in time that is encouraging them to say this in one setting, this in another, and that's a curious thing that we want to find out more about. But the more you do a literature review and you find out where social desirability is impacting studies and how, then you can formulate your studies accordingly to try and take that into account and adjust for that. So just remember to be precise as you're looking over the potential ways the study was compromised, to talk about whether it was a validity issue or a reliability issue. And I hope that we'll work with these more as time goes on. Thanks, and looking forward to your presentations on Monday.